Hello, everybody. My name is Jeremy Risty. I am a American history teacher at Brandon Valley High School and an adjunct professor through Northern State University. Today, I want to kind of talk to you a little bit about a topic that I find very interesting, very relevant here for us in South Dakota, and that is an overview of homesteading on the Great Plains. Kind of give us an idea of what it was like to be a homesteader during this time period, a little bit of glimpse at their lives and some factors that contributed to homesteading on the Great Plains. And again, I want to emphasize, as the title says, this is just an overview of a lot of what we want to talk about. It's not necessarily going to be specific to individual people or individual, specific groups or anything, but instead it's meant to represent a relatively comprehensive overview of the homesteading experience in general. All right, so understand that it could that this might be a little more. There are individual experiences that are definitely going to be unique for specific families, specific groups, things of that nature. Okay, so the first thing that I want to take a look at here is kind of the background of westward expansion, or sometimes you might hear a very popular phrase called manifest destiny, this idea that it's God's will for the United States to move west and encompass the entire continent. And what we really want to take a look at is why people chose or wanted to move west, particularly after the Civil War. And the Civil War is going to have a huge impact on westward expansion here. And one of the reasons for this is a massive population growth. There was over a million men involved, well over a million men involved in the Civil War. And when those men return home, if they were lucky enough to return home, there's going to be a mini baby boom, if you will, right? We're familiar with that term baby boom as it pertains to World War II. Well, there was a smaller one as it pertains to the Civil War as well. So you have hundreds of thousands of soldiers coming home from the Civil War, and a series of natural births, a large number of natural births occur after that tragic event of the Civil War. But we're also going to find that there will be a massive population growth due to immigration. And we want to dive into that just a little bit more because the vast majority of people who move into the West, especially in our neck of the woods, are going to be immigrants. And there's a few reasons why these predominantly European immigrants are going to come to the West. Part of it is the price. When we talk about the Homestead Act, right, you get 160 acres of land for 5 years, 160 acres of land as long as you could live on it and improve it for 5 years. And the common misconception is that it's free. That's not technically true. You had to pay a $10 filing fee along with any relatable taxes to that. But by and large, that's obviously extraordinarily cheap even for the time period. So the availability of large tracts of land attracts many European immigrants who had virtually no kind of availability of land in Europe. Most of the land in Europe was owned by the nobility. They're definitely by the mid to late 1800s. They're still in a feudal type of system where you have earls and dukes and all that other good stuff, and they own most of the land. So the idea that they could own land, their own land, and that amount of land, 160 acres, that's a good chunk of land, especially when you're farming almost exclusively by hand. There were no tractors yet. That is a very appealing idea for many people. In some areas of Europe, much of Europe is not even farmable. Like, for example, when you take a look at one of the largest groups that'll come to South Dakota, the Norwegians, only 10% of Norway is actually farmable. The rest is rock, water, and tundra. Okay, so only 10% of Norway is farmable. So when they hear that there's vast tracts of untapped land that the American government is basically just giving away, that's a very, again, appealing idea. And in fact, when we think about Norwegians in the 19th century, actually between about 1820 and about 1860, about 33% of the entire Norwegian population immigrates to the United States. We also have to think about European immigration from other perspectives. Not only is it the idea of free/cheap land, But think also about the number of wars and the massive unrest that's taking place in Europe. Think about the persecution that's taking place. Think about, for example, the Irish. Think about the famine that's taking place. So all of these are very, very appealing ideas for many European immigrants, and as a result, immigration will skyrocket into the United States after the Civil War. And after the Civil War is obvious because nobody wants to immigrate to a country that's in the middle of a civil war, lest you get drafted and pulled into the said war. So we're going to find that immigration will spike for a lot of different reasons. We're also going to find that westward migration is going to increase as a result of the desire for resources, particularly if you take a look in the lower right-hand corner, things like gold, like silver, and to a lesser extent copper, tin, and some of these other less valuable resources. But the idea that people could move west and get rich quickly, get rich easily, is a very, very, again, attractive idea for many people, not just immigrants, but Americans as well. Probably the best example of this, of course, is the California gold rush in 1848 into 1849 and 1850. And in our neck of the woods, of course, take a look at the Black Hills gold rush of 1874. That idea is very, that attracts people to the West. The idea that there are untold riches to be found if only you could get there. And so we find that is a very popular idea. And again, we see that most notably, say, in South Dakota with Deadwood, right? I mean, a lot of people don't understand how large the Black Hills Gold Rush really was. I mean, like, for example, at one point, Deadwood was the largest city between San Francisco and Chicago. Right. I mean, it was a massive boom. And so the idea of resources is going to draw people to the West as well. And a lot of these resources are wanted and needed by the burgeoning Industrial Revolution. The Civil War kickstarted a massive industrial expansion that will not stop for about the next 80 years or so. We'll find that it will really kind of begin to dissipate really about the 1960s or so. So I guess really, if you want to think about it, almost 100 years. So the Industrial Revolution will need to be fed with all of these resources from the West. And so the Industrial Revolution is going to also kind of draw people to the West and feed those burgeoning factories of the Northeast. But the Industrial Revolution also kicks people out of the cities. As you can tell by the lower left-hand corner, the Industrial Revolution creates cities that are extremely large and overcrowded and dirty and filthy and disease-ridden and crime-ridden. And so a lot of people say, why am I doing this? Why am I living this kind of life when I can go breathe the clean, free air of the West and be the master of my own destiny rather than taking orders from some guy in a sweatshop, for pennies a day? Why not do that? Why not move west? It's kind of an outlet for a lot of people, which brings us to our last point. The West is a very attractive idea for many, many, many people seeking a fresh start. Again, many of them are immigrants, as we talked about. But a lot of them are Americans too, people who aren't happy with the lot in life that they have in the East. And even Abraham Lincoln, he talks about that. There's a really good quote when he signs this bill into law, and I'm gonna just quote part of it for you here. In 1862, he says, "The purpose of the Homestead Act is to, quote, elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial burden from all shoulders, and to give everyone an unfettered start and fair chance in the race of life," end quote. And then he goes on to say, quote, "The wild lands of the country should be distributed so that every man should have the means and opportunity of benefiting his condition," end quote. And we'll see that even more here when we talk on our next slide about who some of these people are that are seeking a fresh start and new opportunities. Okay. And there you see just some pictures and a graph there that kind of lends to that idea of what we're talking about, these European immigrants arriving in America and immigration to America itself. And you'll see that, of course, that trend goes up and down. And of course, if you look at the trend moving to the right, moving towards more modern times, not only does the number of immigrants increase, but where they come from increases. So it's kind of interesting, where they come from changes. Largely the reasons why they come to America don't really change, though, except, of course, for the Homestead Act. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. And there is the Homestead Act. All of those states and areas in the red had at least some land claimed under the Homestead Act. And I'd like to point out that a lot of that here is not just in the West. Notice what happens here in the South. And what's interesting is a lot of the people that claimed land under the Homestead Act in the South were the newly freed slaves, right? Freedmen, as they were frequently called, who, after the Civil War, of course, are now free people. And they're the ones that largely are going to claim a lot of that land, mostly from abandoned land from plantation owners in the South. I'd also like to point out one last thing. Notice the duration of the Homestead Act. A lot of people don't, they think of the Homestead Act as being something that was relatively a 19th century kind of animal, and that's not true at all. In fact, the last claim under the Homestead Act was filed in 1986 in Alaska. It is one of the longest lasting and most important acts in American history. I don't know exactly what they were farming in Alaska, polar bears or seals or ice cubes. I don't know what they were farming, but the last tract of land was actually claimed in Alaska in 1986. So this is a very, very long lasting and important law. So where are many of these people from? Almost exclusively, a lot of the people coming to our neck of the woods, to South Dakota, they're going to be immigrants. Are some of them migrants from the East, from the American East? Yes. But many of them are European immigrants, and by far and away, the two largest groups are going to be in South Dakota anyway. They're going to be the Germans and the Scandinavians. And when we say Scandinavia, just to make sure we're all on the same page, Scandinavia would be Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Okay, the Danes. You do have some English as well, right? So if you guys, if any of you are familiar with people who have names like Brown or Smith or, Cooper or something like that, those are very, very English names. But in South Dakota, those are the dominant ones. But in South Dakota, we do have other pockets of, say, Czechs, of Russians, of Irish, and you could probably, if you know a lot about South Dakota, you could probably even know where a lot of these people are. Like, for example, there's a big segment of Czechs down in the Tyndall and Tabor area, right? You have Russians around, east of Brookings, there in the Volga area. I mean, Volga is named after a river in Russia. You have Irish in, the Montrose area, and I believe there are pockets of some down in like the Centerville, Irene area. So, this is, you still see that heritage, that ethnic heritage here even today. And why Europeans? Well, we already talked about that, right? Think about the war, the persecution, the availability of land, things of that nature. But it's interesting because a lot of South Dakotans forget that early on, after the Civil War, say in the 1860s, 1870s, there was in fact a significant segment of the West, in South Dakota particularly, a lot of them in Kansas as well, and Nebraska, of freedmen, of these newly freed slaves after the Civil War. And historians, and they actually referred to themselves as exodusters. And the key word, of course, is exodus, right? Not only is it meaning the mass movement of a people from one area to another, but it's also biblical in nature, right? Just like Moses led the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt to the promised land, so too now do many African Americans, freedmen, do they see the West as the promised land after their bondage in the American South. So you do have a fairly significant number of African Americans who are going to move to South Dakota, or what will become South Dakota, and homestead. In fact, one of the most famous of these is a man by the name of Oscar Michaud, who will give up homesteading in Gregory County, and he will move to New York and will become the premier African-American film director. He will direct and produce dozens of African-American films, and is highly, highly regarded, basically seen as the godfather of African-American cinema to this day. In fact, there are African-American Film Awards named after Oscar Michaud, who was indeed a homesteader here in South Dakota in the late 19th, early 20th century. Okay. Now, once they arrived, I mean, and as I try to kind of explain this to my students, think about how overwhelming this is. You are most likely, anyway, an immigrant in a strange land, and you have spent most of your money getting to, this point, getting to your land. Um, but then the hard work begins because there's nothing there. You literally have to build your life from scratch. And that's one of the things, that's one of the ideas that I try to impress upon my students, because I think it instills a sense of admiration, appreciation for the perseverance and the hard work and the diligence that these people had to go through. And I think you really see that in their homes. The homes that these homesteaders used varied greatly based on location and resources available, and as well as the time of year that they arrived. Right? If you are, if it's already fall, you probably don't have the time to build a proper structure. You're just going to throw something together. But we also have to understand that resources play a huge role as well. South Dakota isn't known for a great number of trees, especially eastern South Dakota isn't known for a great number of trees. And there were even less during this time period. We have to understand that most of the trees that we see as we're driving down the highway were actually planted by these homesteaders over 100 years ago, or by their descendants in the next generations. So imagine South Dakota with eastern South Dakota with even fewer trees than there are now. So the vast majority of homes early on, anyway, are going to be sod homes, because that was the resource that was available to them. They would just kind of like Legos or something. They would just rip up and cut out like grass and sod, this tough clayey soil that is predominant in the central Great Plains. And they would just start stacking it like bricks. They would dry them out and they would just start stacking it like bricks. Now, these sod homes, or soddies as they were sometimes called, these sod homes were fairly warm and snug, very durable as far as withstanding wind and things of that nature. Not so much when it came to rain. Not so much when it came to rodents and snakes and mice and pests and things of that nature. And clearly, we're not very clean. I mean, your entire no point in sweeping because your entire house, no point in dusting because your entire house is literally dirt. But they were really one of the very few options available to many people. Some people would choose kind of a different option, which is a dugout. A lot of you who are familiar with Laura Ingalls Wilder books and such are probably familiar with that. Although my ancestors who arrived from Norway, the first year they arrived later in the season, and their first home was a dugout. Actually, their dugout was, or is on their homestead was today Good Earth State Park. They're just kind of by Schindler, kind of southeast of Sioux Falls. So dugouts were also an option for some people. If you had the resources available, the best option was a log cabin. Again, you would have to have the resources, which is one of the reasons why a lot of early homesteaders chose to homestead near a freshwater source, whether it be a lake, a creek, a river, something along those lines, because not only did it provide you with fresh water, maybe some fish or other food, but also most likely it was the only place where you could find trees, not only trees to build your home, but trees for fuel as well. And we'll talk more about this here in a second, but as time progresses, and there's a civilizing influence that will come called the railroad. And once the railroad reaches places like eastern South Dakota, now you can get modular homes. Homes that they will provide all the resources, you just have to put it together. And by far and away, the most famous company that will do this, that will sell these homes, is Sears and Roebuck. In fact, there's a Sears and Roebuck kit home on the corner of exit 406 on I-90 here in Brandon, right? A lot of people, I get a lot of questions. I'm president of the Brandon Historical Society, and I get a lot of questions about that house, that abandoned house. And, why doesn't it fit in with the stereotypical, idea of sod homes or something like that? Well, the reason is it was a kit home. It was a modular home from Sears and Roebuck, as you can see here, right? So you have an option. You just basically, literally, you get the catalog in the mail, you send in the money with your order form of what you want, and then the railroad brings what you need to you. And again, there's a wide variety of homes here. Which brings us to a very important point, that the railroads have a significant influence on homesteading in rural areas like South Dakota. In fact, we could argue that many of South Dakota's towns literally owe their existence to railroads, and Brandon, by the way, is one of them. Railroads allow for more homesteaders, more supplies, and more people to be able to settle in an area. And it also creates, oftentimes it creates the economies that will lead to towns and eventually lead to cities. The first railroad line in what it will be South Dakota was in 1872 at the territorial capital of Yankton. Okay. And as railroads spread out, okay, they will bring, again, people. We think a lot of times of homesteaders as coming in, covered wagons. And that's true to a certain extent. But as the railroads continue to expand, many people will choose to forego the covered wagon and all the heartache and troubles and time and that all the difficulties that has, and they will just come west on trains. And they can do this because the trains will also bring numerous supplies, and as well as soldiers to protect them. And who are they protecting them from? Well, we'll talk more about that here in just a little bit. So notice what's happening as far as the standard of living. Not only are they bringing people, bringing settlers, but they're allowing them to have a higher standard of living rather than just eking out a survivalist kind of mentality in the middle of the Great Plains. So the railroads are an absolutely vital aspect of what's going on here. And we're going to find in South Dakota that railroad expansion will continue thanks to the Black Hills Gold Rush of 1874. As prospectors rush into the Black Hills and are eager to get at the resources in there, as well as Eastern banks are eager to get their hands on that Black Hills gold, using the trains, bringing that gold, bringing that resource back to them. Keeping in mind, by the way, that at that time, the United States was on the gold standard, meaning that gold literally was our money. So the more gold we found, the richer we became as a collective country. And so the railroads will have a huge, significant impact on South Dakota, what will become South Dakota. In fact, there's such a population increase during this time period from 1870 to 1890 that many South Dakota historians just refer to this as the Great Dakota Boom, in which large numbers of Americans, people will arrive in South Dakota, or what will become South Dakota. In fact, by 1890, I say Americans, I have to say people, because by 1890, 1/3 of all South Dakota residents were foreign-born. Okay, about 33%. We also have to take a look at one last aspect of the railroads, though, and it would be unfair to not do so. From the European American perspective, railroads are an eminent good. From the Native American perspective, though, right, the original inhabitants of what is South Dakota, this was a devastating blow, because not only does it entrench settlers even more, bring more supplies, more people, more soldiers, we're going to find that for Native Americans, this was a tragedy and a travesty. Railroads would frequently hire hunters to sit on top of these trains, lay on top of these trains, and shoot as many bison as they could, because the bison herds were so thick that they were literally impeding the progress of trains by these huge, massive herds. So these hunters would just shoot as many bison as they could. Well, keep in mind that these bison are absolutely essential to the way of life for the Plains people. It provided their food, it provided their clothing, it provided, pretty much everything, their shelter, pretty much everything. Their whole life revolved around these bison. And as these numbers are drastically dwindled, the ability for the the Sioux people, the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, particularly, and the Cheyenne to a lesser extent, their ability to resist a European American incursion into their land will dwindle to the point where they are defeated ultimately and subjugated onto reservations by 1890. And a lot of this is because of the dwindling bison herds. In fact, just kind of emphasize that point. When Lewis and Clark came through this neck of the woods, 1804, 1805, right around there, it's estimated that there were about 20 million buffalo roaming the Great Plains. By 1890, there's less than 100. So we're talking about almost a mass extinction of an animal that leads to a subjugation of the Native American people, and the railroads play a huge role in that particular dilemma. Okay. And there you see the massive growth of the railroads. The map in the upper left-hand corner shows the extent of the railroads by about 1860. 30 years later, we have literally crisscrossed the continent, highlighted, of course, by the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. But notice, again, in kind of the southeastern South Dakota, particularly Yankton, Sioux Falls, places like that, we do have railroad expansion there. And also notice that a lot of those railroads kind of in the middle basically end at the Black Hills. There's virtually nothing crossing into Wyoming or anything like that. It pretty much ends the Black Hills. Why? Because of the gold rush. So as homesteaders, what are some dangers? What are some problems that they would face? And most of this is going to be common sense, but hopefully I can kind of emphasize a few aspects that might, underscore a little bit more about why these were so dangerous and why they were so problematic. By far and away, the biggest problem for a lot of these homesteaders is going to be weather. It is still the biggest problem. I mean, we know as living in South Dakota, as the saying goes, if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes. You never know what you're going to get. To borrow a phrase from Forrest Gump, right? It's like our weather is like a box of chocolates. You just never know what you're going to get, and that's really true here in South Dakota. Not only did it affect crops and livestock, right, with droughts and heat and cold and blizzards and all this other stuff, but it also endangered the very lives of settlers. I mean, keep in mind, these people, again, think about the dwellings that they're living in. Right? They don't have furnaces. They don't have air conditioners or anything like that. So maybe a tragic example of how weather is so dangerous is the so-called Children's Blizzard of 1888, which, by the way, is a really, really good book. If you're interested, look up the book Children's Blizzard. You can get it from your local library. But this blizzard, kind of a unexpected blizzard. It was a gorgeous day in January of 1888. It was in the 40s, low 50s in some areas. And so children decided that it was good to go to school. The winters here in South Dakota being quite cold and snowy, a lot of times they would not go to school in the winter. But it was such a nice day that many parents let their kids go to school. And then all of a sudden the temperature plummeted. A massive cold front came through. Many teachers, who, by the way, were not much older than teenagers themselves, decided to try to get their students home before the blizzard got any worse. And over the next 24 hours, about 235 people, mostly children, died in this blizzard. Maybe another example of the extremity of South Dakota weather was a 49-degree temperature difference in just 2 minutes in Spearfish, South Dakota, going from -4 to 45 degrees. In fact, it was such a massive temperature shift, which, by the way, is a world record still to this day. It was in 1943. It was such a massive temperature change in such a short time that it shattered windows across town because the glass couldn't adjust to the temperature difference in time. And by the way, in that same story, within 2 hours, the temperature had climbed to 54. So, nice balmy day. But 27 minutes after that, the temperature plummeted once more to -4. So a 58-degree temperature shift in 27 minutes. So again, weather was a huge problem. Flooding, droughts, heat, cold, whatever the case might be. And even with all of our science and our technology today as farmers, weather is still the one thing. I mean, we can mitigate it through drought-resistant crops and things of that nature, but you can't do anything. You can't make it rain or stop it from raining or whatever. Locusts were also a problem, right, of near biblical proportions. In fact, 1874 was called the Year of the Locust. In that summer, an estimated 120 billion locust, Rocky Mountain locust, ate a swath 100 miles wide throughout the central Great Plains, stretching from Texas into Dakota Territory. As one farmer quipped, quote, they ate everything but the mortgage, end quote. And of course, if you think about that reality, they might as well have eaten the mortgage because obviously you can't pay the bills if you don't have any crops. Ironically, though, the Rocky Mountain locust was a fairly short lived problem for many settlers because, ironically, the locust becomes extinct. Why? Because homesteaders moved into eastern Colorado and plowed up the very fields that held the locust eggs. They plowed up, the basically the hatching habitat that these locusts use. And after that, they really weren't a problem. So I guess homesteaders kind of got the final laugh there. Native Americans were also a problem, as you might guess. They were not happy about Europeans and Americans moving into their territory, and they've seen this coming for decades. And unfortunately, there's very little they can. Unfortunately for them, there's very little they could do about it. But Native Americans were such a problem that early homesteaders in Dakota Territory, they frequently homesteaded near military forts. And probably the best example in the southeast portion of South Dakota is Fort Dakota, which is situated on a bluff overlooking the Big Sioux River near the present-day state penitentiary in Sioux Falls. And Fort Dakota basically then is the seed that will become Sioux Falls, and that's built in 1856. Well, that's all, fine and dandy for the next 6 years until in 1862, the Great Sioux Uprising in the Minnesota River Valley of eastern Minnesota, kind of the New Ulm, Mankato area, and the resulting Native American unrest causes the abandonment of Fort Dakota, and many of the settlers and soldiers, virtually all of them, flee to relative safety in the territorial capital in Yankton, right, about 60, 70 miles away. In fact, the new Fort Dakota will not be built until 1865, and it will be built closer to the falls of the Big Sioux, about a mile below the bluff and the old fort. And what we'll find then is as more people come into South Dakota, into the Great Plains, a new number or series of forts will be built that will be used to protect these people from the Native Americans. And a lot of them are still around today, as far as names anyway, right? Fort Thompson, Fort Meade, Fort Pierre, Fort Sisseton, Fort Randall, right? Those are all names that many South Dakotans are familiar with. Okay, so Native Americans were indeed a problem, and many early settlers did get into violent confrontations with the original Americans here, the Native Americans. Prairie fires were also a concern. A lot of times they were caused by lightning, or perhaps by careless settlers, with fires in their fireplaces, or in campfires or something along those lines. And then, of course, when you combine that with the strong winds whipping across the Great Plains and no trees to break those that wind, now, of course, you have the perfect recipe for a prairie fire. And there's kind of like the weather. There's very little settlers can do about that, right? They didn't have fire departments. They didn't have hoses or anything like that. So prairie fires were also a concern. And last but certainly not least, one that a lot of people kind of forget about, arguably the biggest problem homesteaders had was simple economics. As more farmers flood onto the Great Plains, that massively increases supply. But so too, to a large extent, they're also victims of their own success. New technology comes out here in the late 19th century. Things like John Deere steel plow, Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper. So the average farmer is able to increase the yield of their farms. Now, demand is going up, right? Demand is going up because of population increases due to immigration and all this other good stuff. But supply massively outstrips and outgains demand. And as that happens, prices plummet. right? Crop prices plummet. And as a matter of fact, let's be honest, it's still a problem today. I mean, think about it. The federal government pays farmers to not farm. Why? To keep supply down and prices high. So the biggest problem that a lot of people forget about is simple economics. It's supply and demand. They are victims of their own success. They become too good at farming, and it drives a lot of them actually bankrupt. In fact, if you take a look at this list, about 1/3 of everybody who filed a claim under the Homestead Act failed to live up to the conditions. They failed to last the 5 years. And again, looking at this list, you have a pretty good idea of why. Right? This would have been a very, very difficult proposition to make it 5 years when you look at all of these issues. So how did they survive then? Right? What did they? How did they make it? Right? What was the key to their perseverance? Well, one of the issues that they had to try to solve, of course, in addition to all the dangers and problems that they had earlier, is fuel. Okay, how are they going to heat their homes? And on the Great Plains, that's a serious problem. Back east, it's not a problem because they have so many trees that they can just basically keep cutting them down almost, it seems, at will. As we will later find, that's not really true, but they have much more fuel supplies and fuel options than they do back in the West. So if you have, the ability, wood is preferable. Okay, but for many Great Plains homesteaders, that's not an option. So early on, when there's large numbers of bison herds still roaming the Great Plains, bison or cow manure, dried cow manure, as we're called chips, right, is an option, and that actually is a fairly good option for fuel. It doesn't smell the greatest, not the most sanitary, but it's a fairly hot, easy, long-lasting fuel source. But as we've already mentioned, the bison herds quickly are diminishing, and most people's cow herds are not big enough to be able to sustain that fuel source. Grass is not really an option either. Dried grass, it does not burn very hot, and it burns very quickly. And so here's where the railroads once again kind of ride to the rescue, and they bring in coal from the east, and that will be the predominant fuel source by, say, the early 20th century for many of these people. Clothing is also a little bit of a problem here. Many of these people are definitely the salt of the earth, right? They are not necessarily the upper class, right? They're not the upper crust of European or American society. Their finances are, their profit for margin is very, very small. And so therefore, they don't really have a whole lot of clothes, and they have to make what clothes they have last a long time. And for those of you who have old homes, like my parents' home in Del Rapids, if you look at their closets, that's one of the things they complain about a lot is the size of their closets. Well, they didn't need a whole lot of closet space because guess what? They didn't have a whole lot of clothes. So you had to, make those clothes last a long time. You had to, make them yourself a lot of times. But again, here the railroads help them out a little bit. Railroads, as well as the perfected invention of the sewing machine by Isaac Singer, will allow for ready-made clothes, right? Clothes that are already made in a variety of styles, colors, fashions, fabrics, things of that nature, allows those resources to be brought to the homesteaders in places like South Dakota. Water was a constant problem. Again, as we mentioned, a lot of homesteaders wanted to homestead near freshwater sources so that water wasn't really a problem. But water is a problem for many people. Water quality particularly is a problem. Like, for example, the biggest killer of people in the 19th century was waterborne diseases, things like cholera, things like typhoid fever, things like dysentery. So you had to have a safe, steady water source for yourself and for your livestock. Many people dug wells, which was an option. The problem, of course, is that digging wells is not only very, very laborious, but it's also quite dangerous when you think about, poisonous gases, lack of oxygen, well collapses, things like that. The preferred method of getting water was drilling and then bringing that water to the surface via a windmill. And they become very iconic in the Great Plains. They've become iconic in the West, and that's because almost every farm had one because that was the source of their water. Obviously, you also need food. Okay, and as farmers, this is this is literally what they do. Um, many of the farmers, their major crops are going to be corn and eventually wheat. Now, it should be noted that the wheat that is still grown in America is not American wheat, it is Russian wheat. Russian wheat is far hardier and able to withstand the extreme temperatures, as we mentioned here on the Great Plains. So, corn and wheat are going to be and oats to a certain extent are going to be kind of the major crops. But a lot of that is going to be used for livestock or to sell. Okay. So, how does the family what else do they do? Well, many women and children were responsible for tending the family garden, in which they would plant a wide variety of foods, right? Things like beets, things like carrots, potatoes, radishes, turnips, pumpkins, things of that nature. And then when they would grow them and pick them, they would can them many times and put them in cellars, root cellars, and things like that, built underground, a little bit cooler, out of the sun, right, to preserve that for the winter. They would also raise a variety of livestock, and the key here is to diversify not only your crops but also your livestock. And the reason why you want to do that is so that you can kind of hedge your bets, if you will, based on weather, right? Some crops and livestock do better with heat, cold, things of that nature. So you don't know exactly what the weather is going to bring. So you probably need to have a variety of livestock, a variety of crops. And also think about, what you can get from each of these animals, right? From cows, not only do you get beef and milk and cheese, but leather. Sheep, you get meat and wool. Chickens, you get feathers, meat, eggs. And hogs, you get ham and bacon and all this other stuff. Not to mention the fact that hogs and pigs are basically nature's garbage disposal. They're omnivores; they'll eat anything. That's why we feed them. Back in the day, anyway, you'd feed them slop. Whatever leftovers you had, they would gladly devour. But a last thing to think about here as far as food is that, again, farmers will become better at farming, especially here on the arid, dry Great Plains, which is far, far different from farming back in the eastern part of the United States or even back in Europe. It's a very unique geographic area. So one of the things that the federal government will do is they will pass another law that a lot of people forget about, even though it's a very important bill, a very important law, called the Morrill Act. The Morrill Act was passed the same year as the Homestead Act in 1862. And what it did is it basically gave federal land to states and territories. And the states and territories would then sell that land to homesteaders. And then they would take that money and they would use it to build colleges. And these colleges, these land grant colleges as they were called, these colleges would specialize in farming. How can we improve our farming techniques? So they would obviously have science programs. They would have engineering programs. They would basically try to use science and technology to try to figure out how to increase crop yields. And of course, today in South Dakota, I'm sure as many of you know, our land grant college, our land grant school is South Dakota State. And that's kind of a little clue, by the way. A lot of your land grant schools, land grant colleges will end in state university. So, like, for example, North Dakota State, Montana State, Utah State, Colorado State, right? These are all Kansas State, right? These are all land grant colleges that were used and created to help farmers become better farmers in these unique geographic circumstances of the Great Plains. Right? So what does this mean for us? What does all of this homesteading experience, what does this all mean for us as South Dakotans? Well, we could argue that the homestead experience and the homesteaders themselves, what they created and who they were, what they believed is still very much so alive and well in South Dakota today. You can see this, for example, in the celebrations of their ethnic heritage. Think about, again, check days. in Tabor, or Danish days in Viborg, right? You have these ethnic celebrations, and you have, remnants in the sense of food, right? Like for example, in that middle picture there, that's, for those of you who aren't Norwegian, that's lefse, right? A really thin potato pancake, like a potato crepe, if you will. Or like for some of you, it might be kolash, or if you're Russian, it might be borscht, right? I mean, a lot chislik, right, is also an ethnic kind of food. It's the kind of the official state snack. You go outside of South Dakota and nobody knows what the heck chislik is. But these are all leftover influences from the homesteader generation, right? From that, that time period of 1865 to about 1920ish, 1910ish, right? You also see this in religion. Almost every small town in South Dakota probably has a Lutheran church. And this is largely due to the German and Scandinavian influence, who were overwhelmingly Lutheran as well. You do have, of course, Catholic churches, very predominantly with, say, some Germans, but also obviously a lot of Irish and things like that. So we can still see that influence or that effect here as it pertains to religion. You can also see this to a certain extent in our population differences. There's a reason why eastern South Dakota is largely more populated than western South Dakota is. And a large part of it is, simply put, climate and geography. The eastern South Dakota receives more rain, and as a result, it is more hospitable for smaller farms. West River, South Dakota, not so much. Drier, even more arid. But it has lots of grass. So what does that lend itself to? Large ranches, not as many farms. So you have smaller farms, but more people in the east. Larger ranches, smaller number of people in the western part of South Dakota. And it even still affects politics. Okay, and I'm not going to wade into the current political milieu. I'm not even going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. But I will say that, keep in mind, homesteading was extremely difficult. And this difficulty, this perseverance that it instilled, it's what American historian Frederick Jackson Turner called rugged individualism. It's this idea that emphasizes freedom, independence, and the absence of government interference, right? Just government, stay out of this. I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to pull myself up by my bootstraps. I can do it. We don't need you. Stay out of my way, right? Small government, which, again, if you know anything about the current political kind of ideology, it's a very Republican idea, right? The Republican Party idea, small government, stay out of people's ways, and things of that nature. And you can definitely see that in South Dakota politics, right? We haven't had a Democratic governor in South Dakota since 1979. We haven't voted for a Democratic presidential candidate since Franklin Roosevelt in 1936, which is really interesting considering the fact that in 1972, a guy from Mitchell, South Dakota won the Democratic nomination, and we still didn't vote for him. Okay, George McGovern. 1972, we voted for Nixon and not George McGovern, even though he was from South Dakota. So I think we can definitely see that leftover homesteader attitude even in our politics here today. Okay, so I want to emphasize that this was just an overview. I wanted to kind of tie some things together that maybe just gave you an idea of the homesteader experience. Of course, if you have any further questions or comments, feel free to let me know. You can find my email address on the Brandon Valley High School website, and I'd love to have a discussion with you. Hopefully, when this whole COVID-19 thing is over, maybe I can come to the Del Rapids Library or whatever library is near you, and I'd love to have a talk about this or any other topics of historical nature. So if you hope you found it interesting, hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any other questions, just let me know. Thank you.